At a pharmaceutical summit, my son-in-law's voice tore through the room, dripping with malice. Know your place. A senile old man who knows nothing about herbs. Beside him, his father smirked at me as if he had forgotten the debt he owed the day I pulled him back from death. I said nothing. I simply locked eyes with him, cold, steady, unshaken. They thought I was the prey. Until my daughter pressed play. The sound cut through the laughter. Faces went pale, smiles vanished. And in that moment, they finally realized this was a trap, and they had walked straight into it. I appreciate you choosing to spend your time here with me. One small thing before we start, drop a comment and tell me, have you ever trusted someone for years only to discover they weren't who you thought? Yes or no? I read every single one. I'm glad you're part of this moment. A few details in this story have been shaped for storytelling purposes. The message behind it, that's the part I hope stays with you. The Nashville skyline was still asleep when I pressed my palm against the hotel window. 4 a.m. The glass was cold. The city was quiet. And somewhere 12 floors below me, a man named Vincent Mercer was sleeping in a suite he paid for with money that belonged to my family. In a few hours, 400 people would watch him walk to a podium, and then they would watch his wrists meet steel. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Elias Hargrove. I'm 67 years old. I've spent my whole life growing things golden seal, ginseng, echinacea, black cohosh on 340 acres of Tennessee mountain soil that my grandfather cleared with a mule and a borrowed axe. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a detective. I'm a medicinal herb farmer with rough hands and a tattered notebook I've carried for 20 years. And if you'd told me 2 years ago that I'd be standing in a Nashville hotel room preparing to dismantle a pharmaceutical empire, I would have laughed and gone back to my rows. The notebook was on the desk behind me. Brown leather cracked along the spine, pages soft from handling. Eleanor started it. My wife. She cataloged every formula we developed together, ratios, drying times, seasonal adjustments, harvest windows. 40 years of knowledge pressed between those covers like dried flowers. You ever hold something in your hand so long you forget it's there until someone tries to take it? I turned from the window and sat on the edge of the bed. The hotel room smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air, nothing like the wet earth and wild mint I wake up to at home. I picked up the coffee the front desk had sent up. Black, bitter, barely warm. I drank it anyway. A man doesn't sleep much the night before he changes everything. Let me tell you what that notebook holds. Every page is a record, dates, names, measurements, observations. But there's something missing from those pages, something I left out on purpose. The final step in our flagship formula. A quantitative key, a precise ratio that activates the compound and makes it safe. Without that step, the formula is incomplete, worse than incomplete, dangerous. I never wrote it down. It lives in my head the way my grandfather kept his tobacco curing times in his. Some things belong to the person, not the paper. Eleanor understood that. She was the one who suggested it actually back when we first started selling beyond the county line. She said, the day everything is on paper is the day we lose control of it. Eleanor passed 4 years ago, ovarian cancer. She fought it the way she did everything, quietly, stubbornly, without asking anyone to watch. I sat beside her bed at Vanderbilt for 11 days, and on the 12th morning she squeezed my hand and said, "Don't let anyone take the farm, Elias. Promise me." I promised. And I kept that promise, though it cost me more than I knew it would. The farm sits in the Appalachian foothills east of Knoxville. 340 acres of rolling green that turns gold in October and smells like heaven after rain. We grow 17 varieties of medicinal herbs, all certified organic, all hand-harvested. Eleanor used to walk the rows at dawn sorting plants by touch, humming something I could never quite name. I still hear it some mornings when the mist is right. Eleanor used to say the soil remembers everything. Every root pulled, every seed refused, every boot that walked where it shouldn't. I believe her now more than ever. Pete Dawson has managed my herb garden for 22 years. He's 55, built like a fence post, and he can identify any plant in the dark by touch alone. Pete doesn't say much. He shows up at 5:30, works until the light goes, and nods goodbye. In 22 years, he's called in sick exactly twice. Both times he came back the next day smelling like cough syrup and refused to discuss it. One evening, about 18 months before that Nashville hotel room, Pete was helping me seal the drying shed for the night. He watched me mix a batch from memory. No notes, no measuring cups, just my hands and 40 years of practice, and he said, "Boss, are you ever going to write that part down?" I looked at him. Pete doesn't ask unnecessary questions. If he was asking, it meant he'd been thinking about it. The day I write it down is the day someone takes it from me, I said. He nodded slowly the way he does when he agrees, but wishes he didn't. Then he locked the shed door, touched the brim of his cap, and walked to his truck without another word. I stood there in the fading light listening to his engine turn over, and I thought about Eleanor's rule. I thought about the farm, the formula, the 3 generations of knowledge folded into that notebook. I thought about how safe it all felt, the land under my boots, the rows stretching out clean and green, the quiet certainty that what we'd built was ours and would stay ours. I was wrong about that. I kept that secret for 40 years. And yet I almost lost it, the land, the formula, Eleanor's name on every leaf, because I trusted someone I saved. Someone whose life I held in these rough hands at 2 a.m. while the doctors had already given up. I sat by his bed for 3 nights, and when he opened his eyes, he looked at me and said, "I owe you my life." He meant it, at the time. His name was Gerald Mercer. And the night I saved his life, his son was watching from the corner of the room, not with grief, but with something I wouldn't recognize until it was far too late. But before that hospital room, there was a dinner. November 2021. I drove my truck west on Highway 70 toward Belle Meade, a neighborhood in Nashville where the lawns cost more than most people's houses. Nora had invited me. My daughter, 34 years old, a clinical pharmacist with her mother's steady hands and my stubborn silence. She'd married Vincent Mercer 2 years earlier, believing love was enough. I wanted to believe that too. The mansion sat behind a wrought iron gate like a thing that needed guarding. $8 million of limestone and glass. Vincent Mercer, 38, stood in the doorway in a tailored charcoal suit, extending a hand so smooth it had never touched soil. His smile was calibrated to the millimeter. "Elias, we've been looking forward to this." I stepped inside. The foyer was marble. The ceilings stretched 6 meters high. Oil paintings lined the hallway, landscapes of places I doubted anyone in this family had ever walked through. The air smelled like cologne and roasted lamb, rich and heavy, the kind of smell designed to make a guest feel welcomed and small at the same time. Gerald Mercer, 65, met me in the dining room, the man whose life I'd saved 18 years earlier. He shook my hand with a grip as soft as his conscience and said, "Elias, it's been too long." His wife, Diane, 62, glittered beside him with jewelry that could have paid for a year of my farm operations. Her smile was as polished and hollow as the marble we'd just walked across. "Your land must be beautiful this time of year," Diane said, pouring me wine I hadn't asked for. "And this infrastructure development near your area, is the county moving forward with that?" I told her I didn't follow county politics much. "Oh, but you should," she said. "Land values shift so quickly when roads go in. Have you ever sat at a table and realized hours later that every question asked had a price tag attached to it?" That's what that dinner was. Diane asked about acreage. Gerald asked about distribution. Vincent said almost nothing. He sat at the far end of the table, cutting his lamb into precise squares, watching me the way a man watches a lock he's already decided to pick. Nora sat between them, happy, oblivious, refilling water glasses. On the drive home, she said, "Dad, they really like you." I nodded. The red wine I'd barely touched was still sour on my tongue. I didn't tell her what I was thinking because I wasn't sure yet. But something in that house felt like a draft coming from a window that wasn't open. I only understood later the most dangerous person in the room was the one who spoke the least. Now let me take you back further. December 2006, 15 years before that dinner. The phone rang at 11:45 at night, and it was Diane Mercer, crying so hard I could barely make out the words. Gerald was at Vanderbilt, acute liver failure. The doctors had done what they could. They were preparing the family. I knew Gerald through the regional herb trade he'd bought from me for years back before Mercer Medical became what it became. We weren't close. But Diane knew about my remedies, and she was desperate enough to call a farmer at midnight. I grabbed my medicine bag and drove 90 minutes through sleet. 3 nights I sat in that plastic chair. 3 nights the monitors beeped like a clock counting down someone else's life. And I stayed because that's what you do when a man is dying and you can help. I used compresses Eleanor and I had developed together, liver support blends, things no hospital formulary would recognize. I adjusted dosages by hand, watched his color, checked his breathing every hour. The nurses let me stay because Diane insisted, and because nothing they were doing was working. On the 3rd morning, Gerald opened his eyes. His skin was still yellow, but his breathing had steadied. He looked at me, this man I barely knew. This man whose bedside I'd occupied for 72 hours, and his hand found mine. "Elias," he whispered, "I owe you my life, my life." I squeezed his hand and told him to rest. But here is what I didn't notice until years later when the memory surfaced like something buried in bad soil. In the corner of that hospital room there was a boy, 19 years old, Vincent Mercer. He stood with his back against the wall, arms crossed, eyes red. I assumed it was fear for his father. I assumed it was grief. It wasn't. His eyes weren't on Gerald. They were on my medicine bag. The leather satchel sitting on the chair beside me, the one Eleanor had stitched herself, the one that held the remedies I'd mixed by hand in my kitchen at midnight before driving through a storm to save a stranger's life. Vincent was looking at that bag the way a man looks at a safe he intends to open. It was inventory, not grief, inventory. I didn't see it then. I saw a scared boy watching his father almost die. I saw red eyes and trembling hands, and I felt sorry for him. I drove home at 4 a.m. with snow falling on the windshield. Eleanor was asleep. I sat beside her on the edge of our bed, still smelling like hospital antiseptic and stale vending machine coffee, and I thought, I just did something good, something. If I had known that 18 years later that one act of kindness would become the first thread in a web designed to take everything I owned, my land, my formula, my wife's name on every leaf we ever grew, I would still do it again. But I wouldn't sleep as peacefully as I did that night. That thread, the one that started in a hospital room in 2006, didn't pull tight for another 17 years. It waited the way all well-built traps do until the person inside felt safe enough to stop looking down. When a man who owes you his life offers you a business deal, what kind of fool says no? May 2023, 6 months after Nora married Vincent. I drove to the Mercer medical offices in downtown Nashville, a glass tower that smelled like new carpet and ambition. Vincent met me in a conference room on the 14th floor. The city spread out behind him like something he'd already purchased. Gerald sat at the head of the table in a navy blazer, his hands folded, delivering a speech about legacy and tradition that sounded like it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. The pitch was simple. Mercer Medical wanted to launch a cancer support supplement line powered by Hargrove herbs. Traditional medicine meets modern distribution. My formulas, their infrastructure. My name on the label, their trucks on the highway. Vincent leaned forward and said, "This isn't business, Elias. This is family honoring family." I looked at Gerald. He nodded with that soft, grateful expression I remembered from his hospital bed. The man whose life I'd held together with compresses and sleepless nights was sitting across from me offering a partnership, and every instinct I had said this was right. Let me tell you something about the word family. It's the most expensive word in the English language when the wrong person uses it, but I didn't know that yet, not in May. I signed a basic supply agreement. Nothing exclusive, nothing permanent, just an initial contract to provide raw materials at fair market price. The pen felt heavier than it should have. The boardroom coffee tasted like money, dark and bitter and served in cups too small to be honest. But I told myself this was Gerald's way of repaying a debt, and I believed it because I needed to. I drove home that afternoon with the windows down and the contract on the passenger seat. Pete was waiting by the drying shed, stacking trays the way he always does, methodically without wasted motion. I told him the news. Mercer Medical, national distribution. Our herbs in pharmacies from Memphis to Milwaukee. Pete set down the tray he was holding. He looked at me for a long moment, then he picked the tray back up and went back to stacking. He didn't smile. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't say a single word. In 22 years, Pete Dawson had never failed to nod when I told him good news. He nodded when Nora graduated pharmacy school. He nodded when we cleared the South Field. He nodded when Eleanor's test results came back clean the first time before they stopped coming back clean. But that afternoon, standing in the gold light of a Tennessee evening with the smell of crushed mint rising from the garden beds Pete just worked, and his silence said more than any sentence could have. I didn't ask him why. I should have. Instead, I went inside, poured a glass of well water, and sat on the porch watching the sun drop behind the foothills. I told myself Pete was just tired. 2 months later, on a foggy Monday morning in July, Pete found the footprints. I was in the kitchen when he came to the door. He didn't knock. Pete never knocks. He just stands there until you notice him, which tells you something about the man. I looked up from my coffee and saw his face, and I knew something was off before he opened his mouth. "Boss," he said. "Someone was in the storage shed and they weren't wearing boots." I followed him out. The ground around the storage area was soft red clay, still damp from overnight rain, and there they were, leather-soled shoe prints. Dress shoes. The kind of shoes nobody wears on a working farm. They led from the gravel drive to the shed door, circled inside, and came back out. A liar who hesitates is an amateur. A liar who gives you the name, the day, and the reason in one breath, that's a professional. I called Vincent that evening. He picked up before the second ring. "Oh, that's Jake," he said, easy and warm, like I'd asked him about the weather. "Jake from the delivery crew. I asked him to check the storage temp last Tuesday. Should have mentioned it, sorry about that, Elias." Jake. Tuesday. Storage temperature. 3 details delivered without a pause, without a breath, without the slightest crack in his voice. I thanked him and hung up. Then I opened my notebook. I wrote down exactly what he'd said, the name, the day, the reason, the way Eleanor taught me to record everything. Then I pulled out the delivery roster for that week. I ran my finger down every name on the manifest, every driver, every helper, every temp worker who'd touched our property in the past 30 days. There was no Jake. Not on Tuesday, not on Wednesday, not any day that week or the week before. No Jake had ever appeared on a single Mercer medical delivery roster since the partnership began. I closed the roster. I closed the notebook. I sat in my study chair and looked out the window toward the storage area at the far edge of the garden. The sun had gone down while I was checking names, and the farm was dark in a way I'd seen 1,000 times before. But that night the darkness felt different. It had weight. It had texture. It felt like something out there was watching back, patient and quiet, waiting to see what the old man would do next. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid, because I was starting to understand. I didn't confront Vincent about the non-existent Jake. I didn't call Gerald. I didn't tell Nora. Instead, I did what Eleanor would have done. I sat down, I got quiet, and I started looking at things I'd been too trusting to examine. Some photographs don't show you what happened. They show you what you missed. A few weeks after the footprints, I was in my study on a rainy August evening, sorting through old photo albums Eleanor had kept on the bottom shelf. She pressed dried flowers between the pages, yarrow lavender things she picked on walks we took before she got sick. The album smelled like dust and her. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was just sitting with the past the way old men do when the house is too quiet. Then I found it. A snapshot from Vanderbilt Hospital, December 2006. Someone, a nurse maybe, had taken it during Gerald's recovery. I was in the foreground, standing beside the bed, Gerald's hand on my arm. I'd seen the photo before, probably a dozen times. But that night, with the rain tapping against the window and the desk lamp casting its yellow circle, I noticed something in the background I'd never paid attention to. I pulled open the drawer and found Eleanor's magnifying glass, the one she used for seed catalogs. I held it over the corner of the photograph. There he was. Vincent, 19 years old, standing against the wall in a wrinkled t-shirt, arms crossed. I'd remembered his red eyes from that night and assumed he'd been crying. But through the magnifying glass under good light, his eyes weren't on his father at all. They were aimed to the left, at the chair beside me. At my medicine bag, the leather satchel sitting open, the remedies visible, the formulas practically readable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. You ever look at a picture you've seen 100 times and suddenly notice something that changes everything about it? That's what happened. The boy in that photograph wasn't grieving, he was studying, the way a student studies a textbook he plans to memorize. My heart didn't beat faster, it stopped. Because the look on that boy's face wasn't new. It was the same look I'd seen at the dinner table in Belmead, the quiet one at the end, cutting his lamb into squares, watching. Vincent hadn't started planning when he married Nora. He'd started planning when he was 19 years old, standing in a hospital room watching a farmer save his father's life with a bag full of secrets. 18 years. He'd been watching for 18 years, and I'd been blind for every single one of them. I set the photograph down. My coffee had gone cold hours ago. I didn't touch it. I sat in that chair until the rain stopped, and when the first gray light came through the window, I picked up the phone and called Arthur Klein. Arthur Klein was 58, an agricultural property attorney with reading glasses perpetually at the tip of his nose and a reputation for never losing a land dispute in 22 years. He'd handled our property filings since Eleanor and I bought the South Field in 1998. I trusted him the way I trusted Pete, with the quiet certainty of decades. I drove to his office in downtown Nashville that same week. 22nd floor leather chairs, the city spread out below like a circuit board. I brought the supply contract I'd signed with Mercer Medical 3 months earlier and set it on his desk. "I need you to read every word of this," I said. "Every page, every footnote, every line of small print." Arthur looked at me over those glasses. He knew me well enough to skip the questions. He opened the contract and started reading. It took him 40 minutes. The first 18 pages were clean standard supply terms, delivery schedules, pricing tiers. But then Arthur turned to a 7-page appendix at the back, stapled separately, printed in a font 2 sizes smaller than the rest of the document. His face changed. A 7-page appendix doesn't hide in a contract by accident. It hides there the way a tick buries itself under the skin deep enough that you don't feel it until it's already feeding. Elias, he said, and the way he said my name told me everything before the words came. You didn't sign a supply contract, you signed a land mortgage disguised as one. He laid it out. Buried in the appendix was a clause that allowed Mercer Medical to place a lien on the Hargrove property, all 340 acres, as collateral against any legal liability arising from the product line. If a single lawsuit hit the supplements, if a single regulatory complaint was filed, Mercer Medical could claim my land to cover their exposure. How long did they take to prepare this? I asked. Months, Arthur said. At least. This wasn't drafted in a week. This was built by someone who knew exactly what they wanted to take and exactly how to hide it. I sat in that leather chair and looked out Arthur's window. Nashville stretched below glass and steel, everything polished and sure of itself. The contract sat between us like a thing with teeth. Arthur took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. What do you want to do? I thought about the photograph, the 19-year-old boy in the corner, the footprints in the storage shed, the name Jake that didn't exist, the 7-page appendix that could swallow my family's land like it was nothing. I could have called a lawyer that afternoon. I could have confronted Vincent. I could have told Nora and watched her world collapse. I didn't. Not yet, I said. Nothing yet. I need to know more. Because a man who strikes too early warns the snake. And I wanted this snake to crawl all the way out of its hole before I cut off its head. So I waited. I let the contract sit in Arthur's safe like a loaded gun with the serial numbers showing, and I went home and tended my rose and said nothing to anyone. Patience isn't a virtue when you're old, it's a weapon. And I was sharpening mine. 3 weeks later, Arthur called me back to his office. He was standing when I walked in, which was unusual. Arthur Klein is a sitting man. He thinks better in his chair, glasses low on his nose, fingers steepled like a man praying over paperwork. But that morning he was on his feet, leaning against his desk, and the look on his face was the one a doctor gives you before the word malignant. Sit down, Elias. I sat. He slid a document across the desk. It was an addendum to the supply contract, 12 pages I had never seen before. The formatting matched the original agreement perfectly. The legal language was dense and seamless, and on the last page at the bottom was my signature. Except I had never signed it. Arthur handed me his magnifying glass. Under magnification, the edges of the signature were slightly soft, not the crisp ink lines of a pen on paper, but the faint blur of a photocopy. Someone had lifted my signature from the original agreement and transplanted it onto a document that gave Mercer Medical expanded rights over my formulas, my distribution channels, and my land. They didn't need my hand to sign that paper. They just needed my hand's shadow, a photocopy thin enough to fool a filing clerk and heavy enough to steal 340 acres. This is forgery, Arthur said quietly. Federal crime. I can have this in front of a judge by Friday. I held the page between my fingers. It weighed almost nothing. Paper light but acre heavy. I studied the copied signature, my own name written in my own hand, used against me by people who sat at my table and called me family. Don't touch it yet, I said. Arthur stared at me. Elias. I want them to think it worked. I want them comfortable. Let this sit in whatever filing cabinet they put it in and let them believe they own something they don't. And if they use it before we're ready, then we'll have them on record using a forged document. That's even better. Arthur put his glasses back on and looked at me for a long time. Then he nodded the way a man nods when he disagrees but respects the logic. He locked the addendum in his safe alongside the original contract, and I drove home in silence, watching the Tennessee hills roll past like green waves that didn't know what was happening on their surface. That same month, September 2023, the second crack appeared. And this one didn't come from Arthur's office, it came from Nora. She told me later what happened, and I'll tell you now because she never could have told it as calmly as I can. Nora was at home, the house she shared with Vincent in Nashville, looking for product files she needed for a quarterly review. She opened a side table drawer in the guest room, the kind of drawer that collects batteries and old charging cables and things people forget they own. Inside, beneath a stack of magazines, she found a phone. Not her phone, not Vincent's. An older model powered off the case, scratched and faded. She knew whose it was before she turned it on. The pale blue case with the cracked corner. It belonged to Lily, her adoptive sister, 24, the girl who'd grown up in the Hargrove house after her parents died, the girl Nora had shared a bedroom with for 12 years. There's a particular silence that happens when a woman realizes her husband and her sister have been sharing more than a last name. It's not the silence of shock. It's the silence of something rearranging itself inside every assumption, clicking into a new position like tumblers in a lock. Nora powered on the phone. The battery had just enough charge. She opened the messages. The last text to Vincent was time-stamped 2:47 a.m. 3 months earlier. I got it, but you promised me Vince. No reply from Vincent. Nothing after that. Just those 8 words glowing on a cracked screen in a dim drawer. Nora sat on the edge of the guest bed. She didn't cry. She told me that specifically she wanted me to know she didn't cry. She said the tears would have been for the marriage, and in that moment she realized the marriage had been dead long before she found the phone. What she felt instead was something colder and more useful. She felt the shape of a question forming: what exactly did Lily get for him? She closed the phone. She put it back in the drawer exactly as she'd found it. She walked into the bathroom, closed the door, and stood in front of the mirror looking at her own face for what she said felt like 10 minutes. Vincent's cologne still hung in the hallway from that morning. She breathed it in and made a decision. Then she called me. It was late. The farmhouse was dark. The phone rang once before I picked it up because old men who are waiting for trouble don't let the phone ring twice. "Dad," she said. Her voice was steady but thin, like a wire pulled one turn past safe. "Are you home? I want to come home." I was quiet for 1 second. In that second, I heard everything she wasn't saying: the phone, the text, the sister, the husband, the whole architecture of betrayal that had been building around both of us without either one knowing. The other was already standing in its shadow. "I'm making tea," I said. She came through the kitchen door at 20 past midnight, soaking wet, and sat down at the table without taking off her coat. Rain hammered the farmhouse roof like it was trying to get in. I set the chamomile in front of her. She wrapped both hands around the cup but didn't drink. Her fingers were ice cold. That's when I knew this was worse than I thought. Neither of us spoke for a while. The fire crackled in the old stone fireplace, and the windows were black with rain, and the kitchen smelled like wet wool and wood smoke. 2 people sitting across from each other in the house where one of them grew up, holding secrets like stones in their pockets, each afraid to go first. Nora went first. She told me about the phone, the pale blue case in the guest room drawer, the text at 2:47 in the morning. She said Lily's name out loud and then stopped as if saying it cost her something. She told me about the affair. She told me about those 8 words on the screen and the missing reply. And then she said something I wasn't expecting. "It wasn't just an affair, Dad. She was getting something for him. That text, I got it, that's not a woman talking to her lover. That's someone completing an assignment." I looked at my daughter, 34 years old, sitting in the same chair she'd used for homework in high school, and she'd arrived at the same conclusion I had. Lily wasn't Vincent's weakness. She was his tool. So I told Nora everything. I told her about the footprints in the storage shed, the dress shoes that didn't belong on a farm. I told her about calling Vincent and the name that came too quickly, and the delivery roster that proved it was a lie. I told her about the old photograph from Vanderbilt, the magnifying glass, the boy in the corner who wasn't watching his father die but studying the medicine bag that saved him. I told her about Arthur and the contract with its hidden clause and the forged addendum with my photocopied signature on a document I'd never touched. Each piece landed on the table between us like a card turned face up, and with every one Nora's face didn't crumble, it hardened. I watched her jaw set the way Eleanor's used to when something needed doing and nobody else was going to do it. Imagine sitting across from your own child and realizing that every secret you've been carrying, she's been carrying one just as heavy. And neither of you said a word for months because you were each trying to protect the other from the same thing. The fire popped. Rain streaked down the windows. The tea went cold between us. Then Nora said the thing that stopped the room. "Dad, there's something else." She set the cup down carefully, the way you set down something fragile. "Vincent's been giving me supplements every morning for the past 7 months. He said they were for stress, a blend from the new product line, something he wanted me to try before they went to market. I've been taking them every day." My hands found the edge of the kitchen table. I gripped it hard enough to feel the grain press into my palms. 7 months. My daughter, a licensed clinical pharmacist, had been swallowing whatever her husband handed her every morning for 7 months without testing it. Because that's what trust does. It makes the smartest people stop asking questions. "Do you still have any?" I asked. "I have this morning's dose in my purse. I didn't take it. I haven't taken one since I found the phone." "Good. Keep it. Don't throw it away. We're going to need it tested." The rain eased. The fire settled into low coals. Nora sat there in her wet coat, her hands flat on the table, looking at me the way she used to look at me when she was 12 and had a problem she couldn't solve on her own. Except she wasn't 12 anymore. She was a grown woman who had just discovered that her husband had been using her as a test subject and her sister as a courier, and she wasn't asking me to fix it. She was asking me what came next. From now on, we do this together, I said. But you have to do one thing. What? Go home. Pretend you don't know anything. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. You want me to go back to the man who's been poisoning me? She said. I want you to go back to the man who doesn't know you've already started winning. She stared at me. The firelight moved across her face, half shadow, half gold. I could see Eleanor in her cheekbones, in the set of her mouth, and the way she processed pain, not by flinching, but by going still. Pour out the supplements when he's not looking, I said. Every morning down the sink, and start copying everything you can find. Files, emails, receipts, shipping records, anything with a name or a number on it. You're a pharmacist. You know what to look for. And you know how to be careful. And Lily, leave Lily alone, for now. She'll tell us more by what she does than by anything we could force her to say. Nora looked at me for a long time. The rain had stopped completely. The farmhouse was so quiet I could hear the old clock in the hallway ticking, the one Eleanor wound every Sunday morning, and I still wound out of habit. Then Nora nodded. Once. The way Pete nods, no wasted motion, no doubt. She stood up, pulled her wet coat tighter, and walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and said without turning around, How long have you known Dad? Long enough to be angry, I said. Not long enough to be ready. She left. I listened to her car start in the gravel drive, heard the tires find the road, and then there was nothing but the fire dying and the clock ticking and the 2 cups of tea sitting on the table untouched and cold. Nora went back. She drove through the rain, parked in the driveway of the house she shared with Vincent, walked inside and hung her wet coat in the closet like nothing had changed. The next morning, she kissed her husband goodbye, took the supplement he handed her with a glass of water, walked to the bathroom, and poured it down the sink. That was day 1. There would be 90 more. 3 months she lived like that. October through January. Every morning the same ritual except the white powder in the glass. Smile, walk to the bathroom, pour it down the drain, rinse the sink twice. The powder smelled faintly chemical, bitter, and metallic, nothing like the herbs it claimed to be. She memorized that smell. She told me later it was the smell of being lied to. At night, when Vincent's phone rang at 1 in the morning and he slipped out of bed to take the call in his office, Nora lay still with her eyes closed, breathing evenly, counting to 60 before reaching for her own phone. She photographed invoices he left in his briefcase. She copied shipping records from the home printer's memory. She recorded his muffled voice through the office door, pressing her phone against the gap where the wood didn't quite meet the carpet. Vincent noticed nothing. He saw what he expected to see: a wife growing tired, growing foggy, growing dependent. One evening in November, he looked at her across the dinner table and said, "You seem better lately, babe." Nora smiled. "Must be the supplements." You want to know what real courage looks like. It's not standing up and fighting. It's sitting down across from the man who's poisoning you and asking him to pass the salt. She called me every Thursday from a gas station payphone in Brentwood. I'd asked her not to use her cell. Vincent might check the logs. She'd stand at the pump pretending to fill up and talk for exactly 4 minutes. Never longer. She told me what she'd found, and each week the picture grew darker. "I have enough," she whispered one Thursday in late January. "But it's not enough. Not yet." I knew what she meant. We had fraud. We had forgery. We had the supplements and the shell company invoices and Vincent's midnight phone calls. But we didn't have the thing that would make it impossible to look away. We didn't have a body. February gave us one. Danny Calloway was 34 years old. He had a mother named Martha, 58, who sat in the Vanderbilt waiting room clutching her purse with both hands while her son fought for his life behind a door she wasn't allowed to open. He had a father named Roy, 60, a retired long-haul trucker who stood beside Martha without speaking, the kind of man who said everything with his presence and nothing with his words. Danny had been diagnosed with early-stage liver cancer the previous autumn. His oncologist had put him on a standard treatment protocol plus a supplemental regimen, products from the Mercer medical line sold under my family's name, containing formulas derived from the knowledge in my notebook. Except they weren't my formulas. They were Vincent's version, the version missing the step I never wrote down. The step that made the difference between medicine and poison. Danny was admitted on a Monday with abnormal liver failure and neurological symptoms that didn't match his cancer. He died 48 hours later. The hospital listed his underlying cancer as the cause. The paperwork was filed by Thursday. By Friday, Danny Calloway had been reduced to a line in a database in a chair that no longer got pulled out at his mother's dinner table. Dr. Samuel Reyes was the attending physician. 42 internal medicine with steady hands and the kind of conscience that made powerful people uncomfortable. He'd been at Vanderbilt for 11 years. He reviewed Danny's blood work 3 times after the death because something didn't fit. The liver numbers were wrong, not cancer wrong, but toxicity wrong. accumulation wrong, the kind of wrong that happens when a compound builds up in tissue because it's missing the mechanism that's supposed to flush it out. Reyes flagged the case. He requested an independent toxicology panel. The next morning, his department head, Dr. Harrison, the kind of administrator who measured risk in contract renewals, not patient outcomes, called him into his office and closed the door. "Sam, let it go," Harrison said. "A man is dead, Dr. Harrison. And your contract is up for renewal next month. Let it go." Reyes stood in that office looking at a man who had chosen his career over a dead patient's truth, and he understood something that most people never have to learn. Institutions don't protect people, they protect themselves. The hospital had a relationship with Mercer Medical. The supplements bore a reputable name. The paperwork was clean. Nobody wanted to pull at a thread that might unravel a revenue stream. Reyes left Harrison's office without another word. He went back to his desk, pulled Danny Calloway's file and sat with it for an hour. Then he did something that would change everything. He took a sealed sample of the supplement Danny had been prescribed, a container no bigger than his thumb still in its original packaging, and he put it in his coat pocket. He drove home that night through the February cold, parked in his driveway, and stood in his kitchen staring at that small container under the overhead light. Everything in his training told him to report it through proper channels. Everything in his survival instinct told him to throw it in the trash and forget Danny Calloway's name. He opened the cupboard above the refrigerator. He placed the sample on the top shelf behind the cereal boxes where his wife wouldn't look and his kids wouldn't reach. Then he closed the cupboard door and pressed his forehead against it. He couldn't throw it away. Some things are too heavy to hold and too wrong to let go. I didn't know about Reyes yet. That sample sitting behind cereal boxes in a stranger's kitchen, I wouldn't learn about it for months. But the evidence was gathering now in kitchens and cupboards and car glove boxes in the hands of people who hadn't yet met each other, but were all circling the same dark center. March 2024. Nora sat in the parking lot of a private clinic in Murfreesboro, 40 miles from Nashville, well outside any Mercer Medical referral network, reading a lab report with her own name on it. The engine idled. The parking lot smelled like asphalt and exhaust. And for the first time in her career as a pharmacist, she wished she couldn't understand what the numbers meant. She'd brought 2 samples, one of the supplement Vincent had been handing her every morning, and a vial of her own blood drawn that same day. The independent analysis was thorough. The supplement contained a compound that at the dosage prescribed caused sleep disruption, reduced concentration, and progressive emotional instability with prolonged use. It wasn't medicine. It was designed to make her foggy dependent and too confused to ask questions. 7 months. 210 mornings. Every single one of them she'd taken a capsule from the hand of a man who kissed her goodbye and drove to work, knowing exactly what it was doing to her brain. Nora called me from that parking lot. I was on the porch watching Pete turn the compost pile. Her voice was flat, the professional calm of a pharmacist reading a toxicology report, except this report had her own blood values on it. "He experimented on me, Dad," she said, "for 7 months. I was silent. 5 seconds. It was the longest 5 seconds of my life and the longest Nora had ever heard from me. I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear watching Pete work in the distance, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not rage, I was past rage. Something colder. Something that had edges. "Are you okay?" I asked. "I'm better than he thinks." "Good, then we're about to finish this." Nora drove home to Vincent's home and put the lab report in the false bottom of her jewelry box beneath a pair of earrings Eleanor had given her on her 18th birthday. She kept the supplement sample sealed in a Ziploc bag inside her work locker at the pharmacy where she still picked up shifts. 2 hiding places, 2 types of evidence, neither one where Vincent would ever look. That was March. April brought something worse. Arthur called me on a Tuesday morning. He said he needed to show me something and that it couldn't wait. I drove to Nashville and sat in his office while he laid a file on the desk between us. It was thin, maybe 15 pages, printed from Mercer Medical's internal document system. Nora had backed it up months earlier during her nightly copying sessions, but hadn't recognized its significance at the time. It was a tracking file. Handwritten notes scanned and digitized in neat columns with dates running down the left margin. My daily schedule. What time I woke. What time I entered the drying shed. Where I kept the spare key. Which mornings Pete had off. Which evenings I drove to town for groceries. The handwriting was small, precise, and familiar. It was Lily's. "What do you do when you find out the child you raised? The girl you took in at 6 years old and fed at your own table and taught to write her name on the first day of school has been drawing a map of your life so someone else can take it apart. I'll tell you what you do. You sit very still, you read every page, and you don't let your hands shake, because if your hands shake, then they've taken something from you that no document can give back. Nora sat beside me. She'd come straight from work, still in her pharmacy coat. She read over my shoulder, and when she got to the third page, the one with Pete's schedule circled in red ink, she put her hand on my arm and squeezed. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The final entry in Lily's file was dated 8 months earlier. One line written in the same careful handwriting I'd once praised on her homework. He keeps the real formula in his head, not on paper. V needs to find another way. I read it aloud. The words hung in Arthur's office like smoke. Then I set the page down and said, "At least she told the truth about that." Arthur watched me from behind his desk. Nora was still holding my arm. The late afternoon light was coming through the windows at a low angle, catching the dust in the air, making the room look older than it was. "She did this from inside the house, Dad," Nora said quietly. I nodded. Inside the house. Inside the family. Lily had sat at our kitchen table and eaten Eleanor's cooking and slept in the room next to Nora's, and the whole time, maybe not the whole time, maybe not at first, but eventually she'd been mapping my routines for Vincent, the way a scout maps terrain before an invasion. I traced her handwriting with my finger, the loops on her L's, the way she crossed her T's high, the way I'd taught her. My own penmanship reflected back at me in the service of my own destruction. "How much does Lily know?" I asked. Arthur looked at the file, then back at me. "Enough to hurt you, not enough to finish you." I nodded. That's the difference between danger and disaster. Danger means someone knows where you live. Disaster means they know how to get inside. Lily had drawn the map, but she'd reached the wall I'd built 40 years ago, the wall that existed only in my memory, in the unwritten step that no document could capture and no spy could steal. The formula was still mine, and now I knew exactly who had tried to take it. Lily had the map, but not the key. And while she was drawing pictures of my life for Vincent, I'd been building something of my own, something none of them knew about, not even Nora. That changed in May. Nora had been methodical about the files she copied during her months inside. She'd backed up everything to an encrypted drive she kept in her pharmacy locker: invoices, purchase orders, shipping manifests, internal memos. Most of it was dense and administrative, the kind of paperwork that puts you to sleep unless you know what you're looking for. She'd been working through it in batches, cross-referencing supplier names against public business registries, looking for anything that connected the Mercer operation to outside entities. She was halfway through the third stack of invoices when she found it. Klein Agricultural LLC. The name was printed in plain black type on a raw materials purchase order, a quarterly shipment of botanical extracts routed through a company registered in Knoxville, Arthur's surname, on a supplier feeding directly into the Mercer medical supply chain. Nora stood up so fast the chair hit the wall behind her. The invoice trembled in her hand. She told me later that for 30 seconds she couldn't breathe. Arthur Klein, the man reviewing our contracts, the man who'd found the forged signature, the man sitting in the middle of every strategy meeting, was on the Mercer payroll, or so it looked. She drove to the farm that afternoon without calling ahead. She came through the front door with the invoice in her hand, and a look on her face I hadn't seen since she was 15 and caught a boy lying to her at a school dance. "Dad," she said, "Arthur's name is on the supplier list, Klein Agricultural LLC. He's one of them." I was sitting at my desk. My coffee from that morning was still there, cold and forgotten. The office smelled like old paper and dried herbs from the storage room next door. I looked at the invoice. I looked at my daughter. And then I did something that surprised her. I picked up the phone and called Arthur. You ever been so certain someone betrayed you that you could taste it and then found out the only thing they betrayed was your expectations? "Come on over, Arthur," I said. Nora found the company. Nora stared at me. "You knew?" "Sit down." Arthur arrived 20 minutes later. He walked into my office, nodded at Nora, and sat in the chair by the window. He didn't look guilty. He didn't look nervous. He looked like a man who'd been waiting for this conversation. "Your father asked me to set that up 8 months ago, Nora," he said. He reached into his briefcase and placed a small black USB drive on the oak desk between us. "Klein Agricultural LLC is a shell company. I registered it in Knoxville the week after we found the forged addendum. Every raw material purchase Mercer Medical has made through that company has been recorded: invoices, wire transfers, routing numbers, receiving signatures. We now have a complete financial trail." Nora looked at the USB drive, then at Arthur, then at me. The room was quiet except for the old clock in the hallway. I could see her processing it, the fear draining out, the relief flooding in, and behind both of those something else. Something that looked like the moment a person realizes the ground they thought was shifting has been solid the whole time. You set up a fake supplier inside their own supply chain, she said slowly. Not fake, Arthur said. Functional. We actually supplied legitimate botanical extracts. Clean product, fair pricing, proper invoicing. The only difference is that every transaction was mirrored to a separate ledger that Vincent doesn't know exists. That USB drive was no bigger than a stick of gum, but it held over a year of wire transfers, purchase orders, and shell company transactions, the entire circulatory system of a fraud empire mapped from the inside out. Every dollar that flowed through Mercer Medical's supplement division had a timestamp, a routing number, and a destination. And every one of those destinations led back to accounts controlled by Vincent or Diane. Nora picked up the drive. She turned it over in her fingers, feeling the weight of it or the lack of weight because the thing was practically nothing. Plastic and circuitry. But what it carried could collapse an empire. How long have you been planning this, Dad? She asked. Since I saw the old photographs. She set the drive down carefully, the way she'd set down the tea that night in the kitchen, with the precision of someone handling something more fragile than it looks. So while I was inside their house copying files and pouring supplements down the sink, you were already inside their supply chain. Yes. And Arthur was your man on the inside before I was. Yes. Nora was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle, catching dust in the air the same way it had in Arthur's office when we'd found the tracking file. But this time the light felt different, warmer, like something was finally turning. I thought you only planted trees, she said. I looked at my daughter Eleanor's cheekbones, Eleanor's stubbornness, and a steadiness that was entirely her own. I do both, I said. Arthur closed his briefcase. Nora picked up the USB drive again and held it in her closed fist. And I sat at my desk in the house where I'd raised 2 daughters and buried 1 wife and kept 1 secret for 40 years, and I thought, we're not done yet, but the ground is shifting, and for the first time it's shifting under them. The financial trail on that drive would lead us to a doctor we hadn't met yet, a man with a sealed sample and a conscience that wouldn't let him sleep. And it would lead us to the dead. The financial trail on Arthur's USB drive did what financial trails do. It followed the money until the money led to blood. 3 weeks after Nora found the shell company, Arthur made a phone call to a doctor he'd heard about through a medical malpractice contact. A doctor who'd been keeping a secret in his kitchen cupboard. The man sitting across from me at a back corner booth of a cafe off Highway 96 had hands steady enough to perform surgery but eyes that hadn't slept in weeks. Dr. Reyes looked older than 42. He ordered coffee he didn't touch. He placed a sealed container on the table between us, no bigger than a thumb, clinical white cold to the touch, even in the June heat. I kept it, he said. I was told to let it go. I couldn't. I knew what was inside. The supplement prescribed to Danny Calloway in the weeks before he died. The product that bore my family's name but not my family's formula. Reyes had run his own comparison. He'd obtained a copy of the original Hargrove formulation from the published ingredient list and tested it against the actual product Danny received. The composition didn't match. The active compound was present, but the detoxification pathway, the step that prevents the ingredient from accumulating in liver tissue, was missing entirely. This product can't be made from your formula, Reyes said. Whoever manufactured it didn't have the last step. Without it, the active compound builds in the liver. 6 weeks, 8 weeks, depends on the patient, but the outcome is the same. I sat with that. The cafe smelled like fried food and strong coffee. A waitress refilled water glasses 2 tables over. The world was going about its Tuesday, and I was sitting across from a man telling me that a missing step in my head had become a death sentence in someone else's body. Then Reyes said the thing that changed the math. Danny wasn't the first. 3 people dead. Not numbers on a spreadsheet. 3 people with names, with families who swallowed a pill with my family's name on the label and never woke up to question it. Patricia Holt, 51. Memphis liver failure attributed to a pre-existing autoimmune condition. Carl Deese, 63. Knoxville liver failure attributed to long-term medication interaction. Both dead before Danny. Both prescribed the same Mercer medical supplement. Both records deleted from the hospital database on April 14th. April 14th, I repeated. Reyes nodded. 2 days after your daughter started asking questions about product data inside Mercer Medical, someone cleaned house. 2 days. Nora had started pulling files on April 12th. By the 14th, 2 patients had been erased from the system. The cover-up wasn't reactive, it was automated. Someone inside that company had a trigger set the moment anyone looked too closely, the evidence disappeared. I looked at Reyes. His coffee sat untouched, a skin forming on the surface. His hands were folded on the table, steady, the way a surgeon's hands are steady even when the rest of him is falling apart. What are you going to do? I asked. I'm here, aren't I? Then we'll make sure Danny is the last one. Reyes nodded once. He pushed the sealed sample across the table toward me. I didn't touch it. I told him to hold it. Chain of custody mattered, and his hands were cleaner than mine in every legal sense. He put it back in his coat pocket and looked at me with the expression of a man who had just placed his entire career on a cafe table and hoped the stranger across from him was worth it. I drove home that evening with the windows down and the June air heavy with honeysuckle. 3 dead. The number sat in my chest like a stone. Patricia Holt had a family somewhere in Memphis who thought she died of natural causes. Carl Deese had people in Knoxville who'd buried him without knowing the truth. And Danny Calloway's mother was still setting a place at her dinner table. July came hot and dry. The herbs needed extra watering. Pete and I worked the rows every morning, and every evening I sat on the porch with my notebook and reviewed what we had: the financial trail, the forged documents, Nora's lab results, the supplement analysis, Reyes's testimony, Lily's tracking file. It was building into something heavy enough to crush. Then on a Wednesday evening in late July, my phone rang at 9 o'clock. I was on the porch. The crickets were loud. The garden smelled like cooling earth and dried rosemary. I looked at the screen. Nashville area code, no name saved. There's a particular kind of fool who calls the man she's robbing to explain exactly how she plans to get away with it. Diane Mercer was that fool, wrapped in silk and self-assurance. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. Her voice was soft, measured, the way a person speaks when they believe they're being generous. "I think we both know how these things end. Be smart. Walk away while you still can. Accept a fair buyout. There's no version of this where a farmer wins against a hospital system." I didn't say a word. I set the phone on the porch table with the screen facing up. The little red recording light blinked in the dark. Diane kept talking. She talked about the land. She talked about the contract. She referenced the product line by name, the distribution deal, the revenue projections. She mentioned Gerald's health as if it were a chess piece. She talked for 11 minutes and 43 seconds without once asking if I was still listening. When the line went dead, I sat in the silence for a full minute. Then I picked up the phone, stopped the recording, and called Arthur. "I just got more evidence," I said. Arthur paused. "From whom?" I looked at the phone lying dark on the porch table, the night air tasting like the end of a long season and the beginning of something final. "From Diane. She called me herself." Arthur backed up Diane's recording to 3 separate devices that same night. By morning, we had a voice file, a transcript, and a time-stamped metadata log that no defense attorney could challenge. The woman who called to scare me into silence had handed us the clearest confession we had. Now I needed the heaviest one. There are doors you knock on knowing that whatever is on the other side will change the weight you carry for the rest of your life. The Calloway front door was painted blue. There was a welcome mat with sunflowers on it. A wind chime made of seashells hung from the porch beam and turned slowly in the August heat. Arthur stood beside me. He hadn't said much on the drive over. He knew what this visit was, and he knew it wasn't legal work. It was something else entirely. Martha opened the door before I knocked. She'd been watching from the window. She was smaller than I expected, a woman made compact by grief, her hands already folded in front of her as if she'd been holding something invisible since February. Roy stood behind her in the hallway, one hand on her shoulder, the other hanging at his side. He didn't offer to shake hands. He just nodded and stepped back to let us in. The living room smelled like lemon cleaner and something baking banana bread. I think the kind you make when you don't know what else to do with your hands. There was a framed photograph on the mantel. Danny, grinning, holding a largemouth bass, standing on the bank of a river with the kind of smile that belongs to a man who has no idea what's coming. Danny Calloway was 34 years old. He liked fishing on weekends. Martha told me that while pointing at the photo, her voice steady but thin, like a thread being pulled through a needle. He worked at an auto parts warehouse in Antioch. He coached Little League on Saturdays. He was diagnosed with early-stage liver cancer in the fall and started a treatment regimen that included supplements from Mercer Medical products that carried my family's name on the label. He didn't know the medicine was incomplete. He didn't know the compound was building in his liver because the final step was missing. He trusted what the doctor prescribed and what the label promised the way most people trust those things without question, because questioning them means the whole system might be broken and nobody wants to believe that. Martha sat on the couch beneath Danny's photograph. Roy sat beside her. Arthur and I took the chairs across from them. Martha offered sweet tea. I drank it out of respect. It was too sweet, the sugar sitting heavy on my tongue like something I had to swallow whether I wanted to or not. Then Martha reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a piece of paper. It was crumpled, folded and refolded so many times the creases had turned white. She held it with both hands, the way you hold something that might fall apart if you grip too hard, and she looked at me. Danny kept this, she said, his last 3 weeks. He wrote everything down. She pressed it into my palm. The paper was soft, worn down by handling by a mother's fingers tracing her son's handwriting night after night since February. I unfolded it carefully. It was a symptom log. Dates running down the left side. Times. Pill counts. Handwritten in blue ink that started neat and steady at the top. November entries clear and precise and grew shakier as the weeks progressed. By the final entries in January, the letters were barely legible. The lines drifted. The pen pressure faded as if the hand holding it was running out of strength. Danny Calloway hadn't been a passive victim. He'd noticed something was wrong, and he'd done what a careful man does. He started writing it down. Dates. He felt dizzy. Mornings he couldn't keep food down. Afternoons his vision blurred. He was investigating his own deterioration, trying to solve the puzzle of what was happening to his body, documenting evidence he never got the chance to show anyone. You want to know what evidence weighs the most? It's not a USB drive full of financial records. It's not 11 minutes of a woman confessing her crimes on tape. It's a piece of paper written by a dying man who still believed in you. He trusted that medicine, Mr. Hargrove, Martha said. Her voice didn't break. It was worse than breaking. It was flat emptied out, the voice of a woman who had cried everything she had months ago and was left with nothing but facts. He trusted your name on that label. I looked at that paper, at Danny's handwriting, at the place where the pen trails off on the last entry and doesn't come back. Roy's arm was around Martha's shoulders. The wall clock ticked. The banana bread smell drifted in from the kitchen like a ghost of normality. Mrs. Calloway, I said, my name was used to harm your son. I give you my word that will never happen to anyone else. Martha nodded, not because she believed me yet, because she needed to hear someone say it. We left 20 minutes later. Arthur carried the sealed medicine sample Martha had kept in a kitchen drawer. I carried Danny's symptom log. I sat in the driver's seat. Arthur was quiet beside me. The paper lay on the dashboard, small and crumpled and lighter than air. I put my hands on the steering wheel and didn't turn the key. 15 minutes I sat there. Not because my hands were shaking, they weren't. Because I needed to sit still with the name Danny Calloway before I could do anything else. I needed to feel the weight of a dead man's handwriting pressed against the place in my chest where anger lives, so that when I finally turned that key and drove toward what was coming, I would carry him with me. Every move I made from that point forward would have his name on it, not mine, his. I finally turned the key. The engine caught, and I drove home with Danny's symptom log folded in my shirt pocket, pressed against my chest like a letter from someone who couldn't send it in time. Arthur didn't speak for the first 20 miles. He didn't need to. We both knew what that piece of paper meant. The case had stopped being about land and money. It was about names now, names of the dead. Vincent's black SUV rolled up the farm driveway on a Friday afternoon in September without a phone call, without a warning, and with 2 men in suits I'd never seen before. I was on the porch with a cup of coffee watching Pete clear the irrigation line. I saw the dust rise before I saw the vehicle, and I knew exactly what was about to happen. Vincent stepped out, first jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbows, a man performing casualness the way an actor performs grief. The 2 strangers followed. Legal witnesses by the look of them, stiff posture matching briefcases, the kind of men who get paid by the signature. I apologize for the short notice, Elias, Vincent said, climbing the porch steps. But the Nashville timeline is tight. We need this signed today. He placed a contract on the table between my coffee cup and the porch railing. 42 pages, nationwide expansion agreement, exclusive distribution rights for all Hargrove-branded products through Mercer Medical's network. I picked it up and began reading. Take your time, Vincent said, which is what people say when they mean the opposite. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee. I read every page. I read the footnotes. I read the appendices. Vincent sat in the porch chair Eleanor used to favor, crossing and uncrossing his legs. The 2 witnesses stood by the railing like fence posts. Pete worked the irrigation line 50 yards away, not looking up, not looking over, but not leaving either. A signature is just ink on paper unless the man holding the pen has already decided which strokes count and which ones don't. Arthur and I had arranged it 3 weeks earlier. A standard Hargrove signature ends with a small circle above the final E. A void signature, legally meaningless, by pre-filed affidavit ends with a dash. The difference was smaller than a grain of rice. And it was worth every acre I owned. I signed with the dash. Vincent picked up this contract, glanced at the signature the way a man glances at a receipt, and slid it into a leather folder. He smiled the calibrated smile I'd first seen in the Belle Meade doorway 3 years earlier. "Elias, I just want to say thank you for trusting us," he said at the door. "Of course, Vincent. We're family." He shook my hand. His grip was firm this time, the grip of a man who believes he's closing a deal. I watched the black SUV back down the gravel drive, the two witnesses folding themselves into the rear seats like instruments being packed away after use. The dust settled. Pete looked up from the irrigation line, met my eyes across the garden, and went back to work. The signed contract was worthless. Vincent just didn't know it yet. October came. The Nashville conference was 6 weeks away. The pieces were lining up: Arthur's financial trail, Reyes's testimony, the recorded phone call, the forged documents, the lab results, Danny's log. But there was one more piece, and Nora delivered it over a dinner she'll never forget. Vincent took her to the Capitol Grill on a Tuesday evening. White tablecloths, candlelight, seared fillets, and wine lists as thick as paperbacks. From the outside, it looked like a husband treating his wife. From the inside, from where Nora sat sipping water while Vincent worked through a bottle of Cabernet, it was something else entirely. What kind of man takes his wife to a candlelit dinner at the finest steakhouse in Nashville and uses the moment she excuses herself to slip poison into her purse? Nora had planted a miniature camera inside her handbag 3 days earlier, a device no bigger than a shirt button angled toward the bag's opening. When she stood up to use the restroom, she left the bag on her chair. The camera was running. She told me afterward what the footage showed. Vincent glancing left, then right, his hand reaching into his jacket pocket. 2 capsules, white unmarked, dropped into the side pocket of her handbag where she kept her daily vitamins. The whole thing took 4 seconds. Then he picked up his wine glass and checked his phone as if nothing had happened. Nora came back to the table. She smiled. She ate her dinner. She laughed at a story about a colleague. She performed the role of a woman who didn't know, and she performed it so well that Vincent ordered dessert and held her hand across the table while they waited for the check. In the car afterward, parked in the restaurant garage with the engine off and the city glowing through the windshield, Nora called me. "Dad, I have more footage." Her voice was steady. Not calm, steady the way a bridge is steady when it's carrying more weight than it was designed for. I could hear the strain underneath the control, the effort it took to sit across from a man who was poisoning her and hold a fork without putting it through his hand. "Good," I said. I closed my eyes. The footage, the void signature, the financial trail, the recorded threat, the symptom log, the pieces were almost all in place. 1 or 2 more moves. 1 or 2 more weeks of Nora carrying a weight no daughter should ever have to carry. "A few more weeks, Nora," I said, "and just a few more weeks." The line was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know, Dad," and hung up. I sat on the porch in the dark, listening to the crickets, and I thought about Danny Calloway's handwriting trailing off at the bottom of a page. A few more weeks, that was all. Those few weeks turned into the busiest of my life. The Nashville conference was set for November 14th. We had 5 weeks to position every piece, and in October, 2 more fell into place, one that made me sick and one that made me smile. What kind of man prepares a legal case against his own mother and father, not as a threat but as an insurance policy he hopes to cash in? Arthur called me on a Monday. He'd received a tip from a paralegal inside Mercer Medical's legal department, someone who'd seen documents being prepared in a restricted folder and decided the paycheck wasn't worth the silence. What Arthur found in those files was worse than anything we'd uncovered so far. Vincent had drafted a full set of legal documents, affidavits, memos, backdated correspondence, all designed to frame Gerald and Diane as the sole architects of the fraud. If the scheme ever unraveled, if regulators came knocking, if patients started dying in numbers too large to hide, Vincent had built a paper trail that pointed every finger at his own parents. Gerald's name was on the distribution authorizations. Diane's signature appeared on the shell company filings. Vincent's name was nowhere. Nora sat beside me in Arthur's office, reading the documents on his screen. Her face went white. "So Gerald and Diane think they're partners," she said slowly, "but they're actually his backup scapegoats." Arthur nodded. "Think about that for a second. This man married my daughter, shook my hand, called me family. And behind every smile he was building a legal cage for his own mother and father. Not because they wronged him, because they were useful as wreckage. If the ship went down, Gerald and Diane would drown while Vincent swam to shore with clean hands and a story about being deceived by his own parents. "Does Gerald know?" I asked. "Not yet," Arthur said. I sat with that. The dry taste in my mouth was the taste of a decision I didn't want to make but already had. Gerald Mercer had conspired to steal my land, my name, and my formulas. He'd sat across from me at dinner and smiled while his family planned my ruin. But he didn't know his own son had already sacrificed him. "Let him find out in Nashville," I said, in front of everyone. Nora looked at me. I could see the question in her eyes. Was this justice or cruelty? I wasn't sure myself. But I knew this: if I warned Gerald now, Vincent would find out and 17 months of work would collapse. Gerald's surprise had to be real. His reaction in that ballroom had to be genuine. The audience needed to see a father discovering what his son truly was. Arthur filed the scapegoat documents alongside everything else in his safe. Another piece, another weight. That same week, Pete found the tracker. He came to the house on a Wednesday evening later than usual. The sun was down and the farm was dark, the real dark of rural Tennessee, where the nearest streetlight is 4 miles away and the stars are the only things watching. Pete stood in the doorway the way he always does, waiting to be noticed. "Boss," he said, "come look at something." I followed him to the storage area with a flashlight. He pointed to a shelf bracket near the back wall, the same area where those dress shoe footprints had appeared over a year ago. Wedged between the bracket and the wall was a small plastic device no bigger than a matchbox. A green light blinked every 3 seconds. A tracking device. Someone had broken in on a Wednesday night and planted surveillance equipment in my storage shed. In the countryside, we don't smash a hornet's nest when we find one. We watch where the hornets fly, we learn the patterns, and then we move the nest when they're not looking. Vincent's tracker was his hornet. I just needed to relocate the flowers. "Don't touch it," I said. Pete looked at me. "We're going to leave it right where it is, and we're going to give it something to watch." That night, Pete and I worked until 2 in the morning. We moved every real herb container, the genuine Hargrove inventory, the verified stock, the materials that carried the actual formulations, to a locked-out building on the north side of the property. A building that didn't appear on any map, that had no electricity, that looked from the outside like an abandoned tobacco shed my grandfather had used 50 years ago. In the storage area, we replaced every box with fakes, same labels, same dimensions, same arrangement on the shelves. Pete noticed immediately that the fakes were lighter. The real containers had the density of properly dried and compressed botanical material, and the substitutes were just filler packed in identical packaging. But from a camera or a tracking signal, they were indistinguishable. The green light kept blinking. The shelves looked normal. Whoever was monitoring would see exactly what they expected: a functioning herb storage area, fully stocked, undisturbed. Pete stood in the dark, the tracking device pulsing its green light between 2 fake herb boxes, and he looked at me with an expression I'd only seen once before, the day I told him about the partnership, when he refused to smile. This time he was smiling. "Boss," he said, "what are we doing?" "We're showing them what they want to see." That device ran for 3 more weeks. 3 weeks of false inventory reports, 3 weeks of Vincent's people believing the farm was operating normally, that the old man hadn't noticed that the herbs were sitting there waiting to be stolen or leveraged or claimed. Every minute that green light blinked, Vincent believed he was winning. He wasn't. He was watching a stage set, and the real show was 3 weeks away. While Vincent watched his stage set, the real pieces were moving into position. Arthur filed the FBI complaint the first week of November. The arrest warrant was signed by a federal judge 2 weeks before the conference. The FDA assigned a representative. Reyes confirmed his seat. Every domino was standing. All that remained was the wind. Nora was reaching for a bag of spinach at the Whole Foods on West End when she saw Lily standing at the end of the aisle. Lily Hargrove, 29. The girl I'd taken in at 6 years old and raised alongside Nora, the girl who'd eaten at our kitchen table and slept in the room next to my daughters for 12 years, stood under the fluorescent lights, looking like someone who'd been sleeping in her car and pretending she hadn't. Her coat was wrinkled and unwashed. The circles under her eyes were the color of bruises. Her hair was pulled back in a way that said she'd stopped caring who saw her. Vincent had grown cold toward her. That much was obvious. She'd failed to get the formula key. Her tracking file had ended with the admission that it lived only in my head, and Vincent didn't keep tools that stopped working. He discarded them. Lily was discovering what every instrument in Vincent Mercer's life eventually discovered usefulness was: the only currency he honored. Lily stepped toward Nora. Her voice trembled. "Nora, I need to talk to you. You don't understand Vincent. Nora cut her off, not with anger, with something worse: precision. "He's leaving you, isn't he?" Nora said. "You're not the first person he's used and then abandoned. You're just the most surprised. There's a kind of person who betrays the family that raised her and then shows up in a grocery store expecting sympathy. And there's a kind of person who walks away without giving it. Nora was the second kind. She pushed the cart forward past Lily, past the organic produce, past the checkout lanes, and out into the parking lot. She didn't turn around. Nora told me about it that evening on the phone. Her voice was flat, not cruel, empty. The way a person sounds when they've already grieved someone and the funeral is just a formality. Before I tell you what happened next, before I explain how I stood at Eleanor's grave and said goodbye to the life I'd known for 40 years, are you still with me? If you are, drop your guess in the comments. What do you think the notebook will do when it finally reaches that stage? Because after this, the story doesn't slow down. A quick note. The next part includes some fictionalized details woven in for emotional depth. What matters is the truth underneath. Early November, 2 weeks before Nashville. I walked out behind the herb garden to the small clearing where Eleanor is buried. The headstone is simple, her name. The dates and a line she chose herself years before she got sick. Every root remembers. The cemetery isn't really a cemetery. It's a patch of ground between the lavender rose and the old stone wall, the spot where she used to sit in the evenings with her knees drawn up watching the light change across the foothills. Red and gold leaves covered the ground. The air smelled like wet earth and the last of the season's rosemary. I stood there with my hands in my coat pockets, and I talked to her the way I always do, not in prayer, but in conversation. The way you talk to someone who knows you better than you know yourself. Eleanor, I'm about to do something that could break everything, I said, or save everything. I don't know which yet, but I'm sure of one thing you wouldn't want me to give up. The wind moved through the lavender. A few leaves scraped across the headstone. I thought about the night she squeezed my hand at Vanderbilt and made me promise to keep the farm. I thought about the notebook she'd started, the formulas she'd cataloged, the rows she'd walked at dawn, humming that song I could never name. Eleanor used to say that the hardest part of leaving isn't the going, it's the knowing that when you come back, everything will be different. I stood at her grave and understood what she meant for the first time. When I came back from Nashville, I'd either be a man who saved his family's name or a man who lost everything trying. There was no middle ground left. Okay, Eleanor, I said, I'm going. I touched the cold stone once. Then I walked back through the garden, past the rows she'd planted, past the drying shed where Pete was stacking the last trays of the season, past the porch where I'd recorded Diane's confession, and into the house. Pete called from the kitchen. Boss, the car's ready. The old red Ford F250 was parked in the gravel drive. I'd owned it for 19 years. The leather seats were cracked and the radio only picked up AM stations, but the engine ran clean and the tires were good. I put my bag in the back. I put the notebook on the passenger seat, the same tattered notebook I'd carried for 20 years, the one Eleanor started, the one that now held Danny Calloway's symptom log pressed between its final pages. I turned the key. The engine caught on the first try the way it always does when something matters. I drove my old red Ford down Highway 40 West. The November afternoon was descending quickly. The foothills fell away behind me and the highway stretched flat toward Nashville, 340 miles of Tennessee asphalt between the life I'd known and whatever was waiting on the other side. Somewhere in that city, Vincent Mercer was rehearsing a speech about ethics and tradition. He was adjusting his cufflinks and practicing his smile and preparing to stand before 400 people and talk about the legacy of a family he'd spent 18 years trying to destroy. He didn't know that every word of that speech would be his last as a free man. I arrived at the Omni Nashville a little after 9 that evening. The lobby smelled like polished marble and money. I checked in under my own name. There was no reason to hide anymore, and took the elevator to the 12th floor with the notebook in one hand and a bag I hadn't bothered to unpack in the other. By 11 o'clock, 4 people sat in my hotel room that smelled like stale coffee and 18 years of patience. Not one of us was nervous. Nora had arrived first. She sat on the edge of the bed with her hands folded, wearing the calm expression of a woman who'd been rehearsing this night for 7 months. Arthur came next, briefcase in hand, reading glasses already low on his nose. Reyes arrived last, closing the door quietly behind him, placing a sealed evidence bag on the desk beside my notebook. "What's that?" Nora asked. Reyes unzipped the bag. Inside was a prescription bottle, small amber standard pharmacy issue. Danny Calloway's name was on the label. "Martha had it in her kitchen drawer," Reyes said. "She gave it to me last week. I had it fingerprinted. Vincent Mercer's prints are on the cap." The room was silent. We hadn't planned for this. We had the financial trail, the forged documents, the lab results, the recorded call, the hidden camera footage, and Danny's handwritten log. But this Vincent's own fingerprints on the bottle that killed a man was something none of us had anticipated. Arthur opened his briefcase and began the checklist. FBI complaint filed 2 weeks prior. Arrest warrant pre-signed by Judge Whitfield, sealed until activation. FDA representative confirmed seat in row 3. Reyes would sit in row 5 with original patient records and the prescription bottle. Diane's recorded threat backed up on 3 separate devices. The forged contract addendum in a sealed exhibit folder. Nora's hidden camera footage on a secure drive. The scapegoat files printed and tabbed. "What if he doesn't show?" Nora asked. "He'll show," I said. "A man like Vincent never misses his own stage." Arthur closed the briefcase. "Warrant signed. The moment he steps to that podium, the clock starts." Reyes leaned forward in his chair. His steady hands were folded between his knees. "3 families are waiting for tomorrow," he said quietly. "I told Martha Calloway I'd call her by noon. You ever spend a night knowing that tomorrow will either fix 18 years or destroy the only family you have left? I have. It doesn't feel like fear. It feels like standing on a high board, everything already decided, the jump already chosen, and all that's left is the weight of air between you and the water." Nora asked about contingencies. What if Vincent tried to run? I told her his backup plan was the scapegoat files blaming Gerald and Diane. And Gerald would discover that betrayal tomorrow morning in front of 400 people when Arthur presented the documents on screen. Vincent wouldn't run. He'd reach for his insurance, and his insurance would explode in his hands. They left one by one. Reyes first, then Arthur, then Nora. She stopped at the door. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Eleanor would be proud of you." I nodded. She closed the door. I sat alone in that hotel room with the notebook on the desk and the Nashville skyline glowing through the window, the same view I described at the beginning of this story, the same glass, the same city lights, and I didn't sleep. Not because I couldn't, because I didn't want to. I wanted to be awake for every remaining hour of the world where this hadn't happened yet. At 6 in the morning, I showered, dressed, and drank coffee that tasted like it had been brewed by someone who'd never seen a coffee bean. At 7:30, I rode the elevator down to the lobby. The conference was already assembling. Registration tables lined the atrium. Name badges spread in alphabetical rows. Men and women in pressed suits moved through the space with the purposeful energy of people who believed they were about to witness a business triumph. I stood near the elevator bank with my hands in my pockets and watched. At 8 o'clock, the Mercer family arrived. Vincent came through the lobby doors first. Navy suit, white shirt, no tie. He adjusted his cufflinks as he walked, a gesture so practiced it was almost involuntary. Behind him, Diane glided in wearing jewelry that caught the chandelier light, greeting investors with the warmth of a woman who counted every handshake in dollars. Gerald followed, last shaking hands with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the smile of a man who had spent his whole life performing gratitude he didn't feel. Vincent walked past me, 6 feet away, close enough to smell his cologne, something expensive, something designed to make people trust him. He looked right through me like I was furniture. The old farmer from Tennessee in a wrinkled jacket standing by the elevators with his hands in his pockets, I didn't register. I wasn't a threat. I wasn't a player. I wasn't anything worth noticing. That was the last mistake Vincent Mercer ever made as a free man. I stepped into a side corridor and pulled out my phone. Nora picked up on the first ring. "Ready," I said. "Been ready for 7 months, Dad." "The conference starts at 10 a.m. We have 2 hours. I put the phone back in my jacket pocket. The lobby was filling with attendees in pressed suits and laminated name badges. A banner behind the registration desk read, "Mercer Medical Tradition Innovation Trust." Somewhere upstairs, Arthur was opening his briefcase for the last time. Somewhere in row 3, a woman from the FDA was reviewing her notes. Somewhere in row 5, Reyes was sitting with his hands folded and a dead man's prescription bottle sealed in an evidence bag beside him. And Vincent Mercer was backstage adjusting his microphone, preparing to deliver the last speech of his life. 10 o'clock. The grand ballroom doors closed. 400 people settled into their seats with programs and coffee cups and the comfortable expectation that the next hour would be about business. They had no idea what they were about to witness. The chandelier lights dimmed, and Vincent Mercer walked to the podium like a man who had never once been told no. He looked perfect. Navy suit, crisp white shirt, no tie, the studied casualness of a man who wanted to appear approachable while controlling every molecule of air in the room. Behind him, a massive screen displayed images of the Hargrove herb garden, my rose, my soil, my wife's life's work presented as if they belonged to him. Soft music played. The lighting was warm. The whole production was designed to make 400 people feel like they were witnessing the birth of something noble. Vincent spoke for 15 minutes. His voice was smooth and measured. He talked about medical ethics. He talked about traditional medicine. He talked about bridging the gap between ancient wisdom and modern distribution with the kind of reverence that only a man who understood neither could muster. He used words like heritage and partnership and trust, words that tasted like ash in my mouth as I sat in row 8, my hands folded in my lap, the notebook tucked inside my jacket. Gerald sat in the front row beside Diane. He nodded along to his son's speech the way a man nods at a sermon he's heard before. Diane's jewelry caught the stage lights every time she moved. They looked like the royal family of a kingdom built on sand. Vincent built to his crescendo, the $200 million nationwide distribution deal. The crowd murmured appreciatively. Investors leaned forward, and then Vincent smiled his calibrated smile and said the words I'd been waiting 18 years to hear. I'd like to bring to the stage the man whose family wisdom made all of this possible. Please welcome my father-in-law, Elias Hargrove. Applause. 400 pairs of hands. I stood from row 8 and walked toward the stage. The aisle was long. The lights were bright. My boots, the same work boots I wore on the farm, sounded wrong against the ballroom carpet, too heavy, too real for this polished room. But I walked steadily because a man who's been planning something for 18 years doesn't rush the last 50 feet. Let me tell you what it feels like to shake the hand of the man who stole your wife's formulas, drugged your daughter, and put your family's name on medicine that killed 3 people and smile while you do it. It feels like holding a live wire with dry hands. Every nerve in your body screams. But you hold on because the moment you let go is the moment the current reaches the right place. Vincent shook my hand. His grip was firm, the grip of a man who believed he owned me. I let him believe it for 12 more seconds. He stepped aside to give me the podium. The microphone was warm from his hands. 400 faces looked up at me. Investors, doctors, journalists, distributors, expecting gratitude, expecting a humble farmer to say thank you. Thank you, Vincent, I said. My voice was calm, unhurried. The Tennessee cadence that Eleanor always said made people lean in because they were afraid they'd miss something. But before we talk about the future, I'd like to introduce someone who knows this product better than anyone in this room. Vincent's smile flickered. Not much a quarter second, a micro adjustment around the eyes. He didn't know what was coming. But some part of him, some animal instinct buried under all that polish, felt the floor shift. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, my daughter. Nora walked out from behind the stage curtain. She wore sage green, Eleanor's favorite color, chosen deliberately. Her hair was pulled back. Her shoes were flat. She carried nothing in her hands. She didn't need to. Everything she carried was in her voice. She was 34 years old, standing in front of 400 strangers, and her voice didn't shake once. She crossed the stage, and I handed her the microphone. Our fingers touched for half a second. Her hand was steady. Mine was too. We'd rehearsed nothing we didn't need to. Some things you prepare for with words, and some things you prepare for by living through them. Nora turned to face the audience. Then she turned to face Vincent. My name is Nora Hargrove, she said. I'm his daughter. She gestured toward me. And for 7 months I worked inside your company. The room shifted, not a gasp, something quieter, the sound of 400 people recalculating. Vincent took a half step toward the microphone. Nora, this isn't the 7 months. Nora continued, her voice cutting through his like a blade through silk. I copied your files. I recorded your phone calls. I collected samples of the supplements you gave me every morning, the ones you told me were for stress. She paused. The silence in that ballroom was so complete I could hear the air conditioning. Then she asked the question. Vincent, I want to ask you something in front of all these people. She held the microphone steady, her eyes locked on his. Are you selling medicine, or are you selling something that killed Danny Calloway? Vincent's smile did not fade. It collapsed. The muscles in his face rearranged themselves into something I'd never seen on him before. Not anger, not fear, but the blank confusion of a man whose script has been torn in half. He looked toward Gerald in the front row. He looked toward the wings of the stage. Someone get her off the stage. Nobody moved. The name Danny Calloway hung in the air like smoke. 400 faces turned toward Vincent, and for the first time in his life, the man had no script, no rehearsed answer, no calibrated smile, no exit. No one in the room breathed. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Vincent broke it the way a drowning man breaks the surface, desperate and loud and reaching for anything solid. He lunged for the microphone, but Nora was faster. She stepped to the laptop on the presenter's table, clicked once, and the screen behind Vincent went black. The herb garden images disappeared. The soft music stopped. For one heartbeat, the ballroom held its breath in total darkness. Then the screen came back, and it was red. The first slide was a side-by-side comparison. On the left, the original Hargrove formula, Eleanor's ratios, her measurements, her handwriting digitized and projected 12 feet tall. On the right, the Mercer medical version, identical in every way except one. The final detoxification step was missing. A bright red box highlighted the gap. The words underneath read, "Modified without authorization, final safety step removed." Nora's voice came through the speakers, calm and clinical. "This is what your company manufactured. This is what patients received. The difference between these two formulas is the difference between medicine and poison." Vincent grabbed the edge of the podium, Turn it off. Someone turn that off. This is fabricated. She's lying. Nobody in the AV booth moved. Nobody in the audience moved. 400 people sat in their seats watching a man unravel in real time. The slides kept coming. Danny Calloway's lab results, liver toxicity values circled in red numbers that didn't match his cancer diagnosis. Altered medical records from Vanderbilt with highlighted discrepancies showing where data had been changed and when. Then the financial documents, bank transactions routed through shell companies' wire transfers with timestamps, invoices that traced every stolen dollar from my farm to offshore accounts controlled by the Mercer family. Gerald stood up. He didn't speak. He didn't look at Vincent. He rose from his front row seat like a man hearing a fire alarm he'd been expecting for years, and he walked toward the exit. Diane reached for his arm. He pulled away without breaking stride. The audience watched him go, 65 years old. Silver hair, navy blazer, walking toward the ballroom doors with the mechanical gait of a man who had chosen his son's ship and was now choosing to abandon it. Watching a man drown in his own evidence is not satisfying. It's just necessary, like pulling a sick tree before the roots poison the well. I stood on that stage, and I watched Vincent's face cycle through every expression a human being can make in 30 seconds. Denial, rage, calculation, panic, and I felt nothing that resembled triumph. I felt the weight of Danny Calloway's name. I felt the weight of Eleanor's empty chair. The next slide was Lily's tracking file. Her handwriting blown up on a 12-foot screen, my daily schedule. Pete's days off, the spare key location, the final note about the formula being locked in my head. The audience murmured. Someone in the middle rows whispered something I couldn't hear. Then Nora played the audio. Diane's voice filled the grand ballroom through the speaker system, clear, controlled, and unmistakable. Mr. Hargrove, I think we both know how these things end. Be smart. Walk away while you still can. 11 minutes and 43 seconds of Diane Mercer describing the conspiracy in her own words, threatening me, referencing the land deal, the distribution revenue, Gerald's involvement. Her voice echoed off the chandeliers. Diane sat in the front row. She didn't move. Her jewelry caught the light from the evidence slide, sparkling against the darkness of what was being revealed. Her hands were in her lap. Her face was stone. Slide 4 is your mother's voice, Vincent, Nora said into the microphone. Would you like me to play it louder? Vincent said nothing. The final slides came quickly. The hidden mortgage clause on my land. The forged contract addendum with my photocopied signature blown up to full screen, the blurred edges visible to everyone in the room. The fraud undeniable at that magnification. And then last, Nora's hidden camera footage, a 4-second clip of Vincent dropping supplement capsules into her open handbag at a restaurant table while she was in the restroom. Eleanor should have been sitting in the third row wearing that blue cardigan she liked, watching her daughter stand taller than either of us ever imagined. She should have been there to see Nora hold that microphone steady while 400 people learned the truth. But Eleanor was in the ground behind the herb garden, and all I could do was stand on that stage and finish what we started together. Nora stepped back from the laptop. She looked at me. I walked to her and she placed the microphone in my hand. I turned to Vincent. He was gripping the podium with both hands. His navy suit was dark with sweat at the collar. His mouth was open, but no words were coming out. Behind him, the screen still showed the forged signature, my name in my handwriting stolen and pasted onto a document designed to take everything I owned. Vincent, I said. My voice was quiet. The microphone carried it to every corner of that ballroom. You're going to say, I did this to you. You're going to tell people I set you up, that I'm the one who ruined your family. I paused. No, Vincent, you did this. I just showed everyone. The ballroom was silent. Vincent's legs buckled against the podium. He caught himself, one hand on the edge, the other hanging at his side. 400 people had seen the formulas, the deaths, the forgery, his mother's voice threatening a doctor on tape. Gerald was gone. Diane was frozen. And the man who'd spent 18 years building a machine to steal my life was standing on a stage with nowhere left to go. Then somewhere near the back of the room, a door opened. 2 men in dark suits walked in without hurrying. They moved through the center aisle with the quiet certainty of people who already knew exactly where they were going. The 2 agents stopped at the foot of the stage. They didn't climb up. They didn't flash badges. They stood with their hands folded in front of them, patient and still like men who had been told to wait for a signal. The signal hadn't come yet. I still had something to say. I reached into my vest and pulled out the notebook, the one with Eleanor's handwriting on the first page and mine on the last. The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the pages turn. 400 people watched a 67-year-old farmer open a tattered brown notebook on a stage meant for corporate keynotes and pharmaceutical announcements. It didn't belong there. Neither did I. But that was precisely the point. I found the page. I read it aloud. December 7th, 2006. 2:17 a.m., Vanderbilt Hospital. Patient Gerald Mercer, age 47. Acute liver failure. Physicians have recommended palliative transition. I looked up from the notebook. Gerald was no longer walking toward the exit. He'd been stopped not by security, not by the FBI agents, but by his own legs. He stood in the center aisle, frozen mid-stride, his back to the stage. The audience watched him. I watched him. "Gerald," I said into the microphone. "I sat by your bed for 3 nights. I brought remedies from my kitchen that no hospital pharmacy would recognize. I mixed them by hand. I checked your breathing every hour. On the 3rd morning, you opened your eyes and you looked at me and you took my hand." Gerald turned around, slowly, the way a man turns when he hears something he's been running from for 18 years. "You said I owe you my life. Do you remember?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The entire room was the answer, 400 witnesses to a debt that had been repaid with theft, forgery, and poison. "And this," I said, pointing to the screen still glowing behind me with the evidence of his family's crimes, "is what his family did to the man who saved him." Gerald sat down in the nearest empty chair. Not his front row seat, just the nearest chair, the way a man sits when his legs have made a decision his pride hasn't approved. He stared at his own hands in his lap. I looked at him and I didn't see an enemy. I saw a man I once carried to a hospital bathroom at 2 a.m. because he was too weak to walk. I saw the yellow skin and the trembling fingers and the monitor beeping through the night. And that made everything worse because betrayal from a stranger is business, but betrayal from a man whose life you held in your hands is something the English language doesn't have a word for. Then Reyes stood up. He rose from row 5, calm, deliberate, the way a man stands when he's been rehearsing this moment in his head for months. He walked to the center aisle and faced the audience. He didn't take the microphone. He didn't need it. His voice carried. "My name is Dr. Samuel Reyes. I'm an internal medicine physician. I was the attending when Danny Calloway was admitted to Vanderbilt in February of this year." The room held still. The Mercer medical supplement prescribed to Mr. Calloway contained a compound that, without its final detoxification step, accumulates in liver tissue. The result is progressive organ failure. It is not medicine. It is a slow poison. Reyes paused. He looked at Vincent, then back at the audience. "Danny Calloway's liver failed in 11 weeks. Patricia Holt Memphis, 9 weeks. Carl Deese Knoxville, 14 weeks. 3 patients are dead because of this omission. Their records were altered or deleted from hospital databases. I have the originals." What do you call a man who steals a recipe he doesn't understand and feeds it to strangers? I'll tell you what you call him. You call him by his name in front of 400 people and you make sure he hears every syllable. I stepped back to the microphone. "I never wrote down the final step," I said. "Eleanor and I agreed some knowledge has to stay in a person, not on paper, because paper can be stolen, and it was. I let that settle. The audience understood. The formula Vincent had taken, the formula he'd built an empire on, the formula that bore my family's name had always been incomplete. He'd stolen a recipe he couldn't finish, and the missing piece, the piece that made it safe, had never left my head. Vincent took the formula without asking," I said. "He manufactured it without understanding it. He sold it without testing it, and 3 people are dead because he believed that stealing something is the same as knowing it." Vincent stood at the podium. His hands were no longer gripping the edge, they were hanging at his sides. The navy suit that had looked so sharp 2 hours ago was dark with sweat. His mouth opened and closed without sound, like a man trying to breathe underwater. He turned from the FBI agent standing at the foot of the stage. He looked past Nora, he looked past me. His eyes found Gerald, his father, sitting in that borrowed chair in the middle aisle, staring at his own hands. Vincent looked at Gerald with the expression of a man reaching for a rope in a flood. The expression of a son who has run out of plans and is falling back on the oldest instinct call for your father. Surely your father will save you. Surely the man who raised you will stand up and say something, do something, pull you out of the water. Gerald was staring at his hands. His fingers were laced together. His shoulders were curved forward. He looked like a man praying, or a man who had forgotten how. He didn't look up, not once. Gerald never looked up. His son's eyes searched for him across that ballroom like a drowning man scanning the shore for a hand, and Gerald sat in that borrowed chair with his fingers laced together and gave him nothing. That silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Vincent straightened his tie. He stepped away from the podium, and he did the only thing a cornered man knows how to do. He attacked. "This woman was fired for misconduct," he said, pointing at Nora. His voice was loud but uneven, cracking at the edges like ice under pressure. "Nothing she's presented is admissible. None of it. This is a coordinated attack by a disgruntled former employee and a confused old man who doesn't understand modern business." He was performing for the audience now, not for us. trying to claw back the room with the same charm that had built his career. But charm requires an audience that still trusts you, and 400 people had just watched his mother threaten a man on tape and his own handwriting forge a signature. Arthur stepped forward from the wings of the stage. He carried a folder, thin, precise, the kind of folder that holds exactly what it needs to hold and nothing more. He opened it and held up the first page. "Then perhaps you can explain these emails from your personal account," Arthur said, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man who had spent 22 years winning land disputes, directing the formula changes that removed the detoxification step. "Sent from your phone. Time-stamped. Verified." He turned to the next page. "And this, a file you prepared to blame your own parents. Backdated correspondence, forged memos, a legal framework designed to make Gerald and Diane Mercer the sole architects of every crime committed under the Mercer medical name." Diane stood up from the front row. Her jewelry caught the stage lights one final time, diamonds and gold flashing against the evidence slides still glowing on the screen behind the podium. "What is that document, Vincent?" she said. Her voice was sharp and cold. The voice of a woman who had spent 62 years controlling every room she entered and had just discovered she couldn't control her own son. "What did you do?" Vincent said nothing. Gerald looked at his son for the first time since sitting down. The look lasted 3 seconds, long enough to see everything, short enough to deny it later. Then Gerald turned away. He sat back in his chair and faced forward, hands still folded, and said nothing. There's a sound a family makes when it breaks apart in public. It's not loud, it's not a scream or a sob or an accusation, it's the opposite. It's the quiet of people realizing they've been standing on nothing. The Mercer family broke apart in that silence in that ballroom in front of 400 witnesses who would remember this morning for the rest of their lives. The FBI agents moved. They climbed the stage steps, 2 men in dark suits, unhurried, professional. The first agent produced a folded document from his inside pocket. "Vincent Mercer," he said. "Federal arrest warrant signed by Judge Whitfield. You're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy in connection with the distribution of adulterated pharmaceutical products resulting in the deaths of 3 individuals." Vincent didn't run. He didn't resist. His arms went to his sides and the handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a sound so small it shouldn't have carried across a ballroom. But it did. Every person in that room heard it. I thought I would feel something when the handcuffs clicked. Relief maybe, satisfaction, vindication. But all I felt was tired, the kind of tired that lives in your bones, the kind that comes from carrying something for 18 years and finally setting it down only to discover that your arms don't remember how to hang empty. The second agent stepped off the stage and walked to the front row. Diane was still standing. She watched him approach with the expression of a woman who has never once been told she's wrong and is hearing it now in the form of steel closing around her wrists. Her jewelry clinked against the handcuffs. She didn't speak. Gerald was led away last. He stood when they reached him, straightened his blazer, a reflex, the muscle memory of a man who had spent his life looking presentable, and walked toward the ballroom doors with the agent beside him. He didn't look back at the stage. He didn't look at Diane. He walked like a man who had always known this day was coming and had spent years hoping it wouldn't. Vincent's voice broke the silence one final time. "Dad." Gerald was 10 feet from the door. "Dad, say something. Tell them this isn't what it looks like." Gerald kept walking. He never turned. And I understood then, standing on that stage, watching a son call out to a father who wouldn't answer, that Gerald Mercer had always known exactly what Vincent was. He'd known about the formula theft, he'd known about the supplements, he'd probably known about the deaths, and he'd chosen silence every single time because silence was easier than confrontation, and easier was the only currency Gerald had ever traded in. The ballroom doors opened. 3 sets of handcuffs passed through them. The doors closed. 400 people sat in absolute silence. Programs still open on their laps. Coffee cups still warm in their hands. The screen behind the podium still showed the last slide, the forged signature, my name in my own handwriting, stolen and used against me. Nobody moved to turn it off. Nora stood beside me on the stage. She put her hand on my arm. "It's over, Dad," she said quietly. I looked at the closed ballroom doors. I looked at the empty chairs in the front row where the Mercer family had been sitting 20 minutes ago. I looked at the notebook still in my hand, Danny Calloway's symptom log pressed between its final pages. "Not yet," I said. "Not until Martha Calloway knows." Have you ever seen your own face on the evening news and not recognized the man staring back? The arrests made the local broadcast that same night. By morning, every network in the country had picked it up. I was sitting in a diner off West End Avenue 2 days after the conference, eating eggs I couldn't taste, when the television above the counter showed my photograph next to Vincent's mugshot. The anchor called me a whistleblower. I wasn't. I was a farmer who got tired of being robbed. The weeks that followed moved like floodwater fast, muddy, impossible to control. More victims surfaced. Families I'd never heard of, the Holts out of Knoxville, the Deases from Chattanooga, filed civil suits claiming their loved ones had suffered the same symptoms Danny Calloway documented in that shaky handwriting. Silenced doctors came forward one after another, each with the same story. They'd flagged adverse reactions, and Mercer Medical had buried the reports. The FBI opened a full criminal investigation. The drugs were recalled nationwide. Mercer Medical's license was suspended. Every account the family controlled was frozen down to a savings account Diane kept under her maiden name. Arthur called me on a Tuesday evening in December. I was standing on the porch watching the last light drain out of the sky over the ridgeline. "The mortgage clause is void," he said. "Court order came through this afternoon. The land was never legally theirs, Elias. It's done." I thanked him, hung up, stood there for another 10 minutes holding the phone against my chest like it weighed something. 340 acres of Tennessee soil that Eleanor and I had walked barefoot on, and someone had tried to take it all with a forged signature and a pen. The federal trial began in March. Nashville Federal Courthouse 4th floor courtroom, so quiet you could hear the stenographer's fingers hitting the keys. Nora sat beside me in the gallery wearing a dark blue dress I hadn't seen before. She didn't fidget, didn't look at the defense table. She stared straight ahead like she'd already seen how this ended and was just waiting for everyone else to catch up. Vincent stood when the judge asked him to. He wore a suit that didn't fit right anymore. The months between arrest and trial had carved the confidence out of his shoulders. Gerald sat in a wheelchair at the defense table, oxygen tube looped behind his ears. Diane kept her hands folded in her lap, eyes on the wall behind the judge. Lily sat in the last row alone, chewing the inside of her cheek. "You think a courtroom is where justice lives? It's not. Justice lived in Martha Calloway's kitchen when she handed me that crumpled symptom log and whispered, 'Make it count.' What lives in a courtroom is arithmetic, the state's attempt to put a number on what someone took." The judge read the sentences without inflection. Vincent Mercer, 22 years. Gerald Mercer, 8 years. Diane Mercer, 6 years. Lily Hargrove, 3 years probation plus 500 hours of community service. All illegally obtained assets were to be confiscated. The Belmead mansion would be auctioned. 22 years. I turned that number over in my head while the courtroom stirred. That was what 18 years of trust and 3 lives amounted to in a building made of marble and procedure. I looked at Gerald as they led him out. He was 72 years old. He would die inside those walls. And I searched myself for something: pity, satisfaction, grief, and found nothing. Just an empty drawer where mercy used to be. That absence told me more about what he'd cost me than any sentence could. 2 rows ahead of me, Martha leaned toward Roy and whispered something. I couldn't hear the words, but Roy's jaw tightened the way it does when a man is trying not to cry in public. Later outside, Martha told me what she'd said. Danny would have called it enough. Roy had answered, "Danny would have been wrong, but it'll do." That was the closest thing to peace I saw all day. A mother and father deciding together that a number on a piece of paper was close enough to what their son deserved. The parking lot was half empty by the time Nora and I walked out. March air still carrying winter's edge. I could smell exhaust and wet concrete and the faint sweetness of Bradford pear trees blooming too early along the courthouse fence. I saw Lily before Nora did. She was standing beside a rented sedan, arms crossed, waiting. Not for me, for her sister. Nora stopped walking. I touched her elbow, but she shook her head once, a small motion that meant she'd handle it. Lily stepped forward. Her voice carried across the lot, thin and bright and brittle as cheap glass. "You had everything," she said. "The name, the inheritance, the father who actually loved you. And you still had to take what was mine." Lily was 24 years old, standing in a courthouse parking lot with no husband, no home, and no family willing to claim her. And she still believed Nora was the one who'd lost. Nora looked at her. 3 seconds. I counted them the way you count between lightning and thunder measuring distance. Then Nora turned, opened the car door, sat down, and pulled the door closed. The sound of it echoed off the concrete walls of the parking structure like a period at the end of a sentence. Some accusations carry their own verdict. Nora didn't need to answer. 7 months of intercepted phone calls, copied files, and recorded conversations had already said everything worth saying. Silence was the only response that couldn't be argued with. I got in the passenger side. Nora put both hands on the wheel, checked the mirror once, and pulled out of the space. I watched Lily get smaller in the rearview mirror first. A person, then a shape, then nothing. Nora drove with both hands on the wheel and didn't look back. Neither did I. The mailbox at the end of our driveway had never once delivered anything that changed a man's soul until April. We drove home from Nashville in near silence, Nora and I, the courthouse parking lot shrinking behind us like a life we were finished living. She dropped me at the farmhouse gate and said she needed a few days at her apartment in Knoxville to think. I told her to take as many as she wanted. Some thinking requires distance, and some distance is just another word for healing. 3 weeks passed. The dogwoods bloomed along the fence line, and the morning air carried that green mineral smell that only Tennessee soil makes when the frost finally lets go. I walked to the mailbox on a Tuesday expecting seed catalogs and utility bills. Instead, I found a plain white envelope, no return address, Nashville postmark. The handwriting on the front was unsteady letters slanting downward like the hand that wrote them was losing an argument with gravity. Inside a single sheet of unlined paper, one sentence, 7 words written in ink that had smeared where a thumb had pressed too hard. "I'm sorry, Elias, I was a coward, G." I stood at the end of the driveway and read it twice. 7 words. That's what all of it reduced to: the partnership, the stolen formula, the forged documents, 3 people dead, a family hollowed out from the inside. 7 words on a sheet of paper that cost 41 cents to mail. Gerald Mercer was 72 years old, sitting in a federal cell, breathing through a tube, and he still couldn't sign his own apology. Just the initial, just the ghost of a name, as if even now, even after the sentencing, he needed one last wall between himself and what he'd allowed to happen. Not what he'd done. Gerald never did anything. That was the whole point. He watched. He approved. He turned away. And when it was over, he wrote a single letter of the alphabet and called it remorse. I didn't burn it. I didn't frame it. I walked inside, opened the top drawer of the study desk, the one with the tax receipts and the warranty cards and Eleanor's reading glasses I still couldn't throw away, and I laid the letter flat between a property tax notice and an expired insurance card. That's where things go when they don't deserve your anger anymore but haven't earned your forgiveness. Some debts don't come with a dollar amount. They weigh what a single sheet of paper weighs, and they bend your spine like poured concrete. 2 days later, I drove to Martha Calloway's house. The magnolia in her front yard was blooming, thick white petals the size of a man's hand dropping onto the grass like they were too heavy to hold on. The porch steps creaked the same way they had back in August, but the house felt different now. Quieter. Not the quiet of grief, but the quiet that comes after grief has packed its bags and left behind only the furniture. Martha opened the door before I knocked. She was holding a folded piece of paper against her chest with both hands, the way you'd hold a baby bird, careful enough to keep it alive, tight enough to keep it from flying away. "I've been waiting to give you this," she said. "I wasn't ready before. I'm still not. But Danny would have wanted you to have it." She handed me the paper. It was crumpled soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded too many times. Danny Calloway's handwriting dates down the left margin, times in the center column, pill counts on the right. The first entries were neat and squared off the penmanship of a man who believed in keeping records. As the dates progressed, the numbers started tilting. The lines grew thicker where he'd pressed harder, as if pressing could make the pen do what his hand no longer could. The last 3 entries were barely legible, shaky marks that trailed off the edge of the paper like a voice fading mid-sentence. In the margin of the final entry, in letters so small I had to hold the page up to the light, he'd written my name. Not Mercer Medical, not the drug, my name. Elias Hargrove. He died still believing the medicine with my formula was supposed to help him. He kept writing until his hand couldn't hold the pen, Martha said from the doorway. Her voice was steady and dry, the way a creek bed is steady after the water's been gone a long time. He trusted your name on that label, Elias. My name will never be on anything that hurts anyone again, I said. I promise you that, Martha. Roy appeared behind her, one hand on the doorframe, the other holding a coffee cup he hadn't drunk from. He'd have liked you, Mr. Hargrove, Roy said. He always said the best people are the ones who grow things. I thanked them both, shook Roy's hand, let Martha squeeze my arm the way mothers do when they're giving you permission to carry something that was theirs. Then I walked to the car, sat behind the wheel, and didn't start the engine. I sat there for 15 minutes with the windows up and Danny's paper on my lap. The magnolia petals kept falling onto the windshield, landing with a sound so soft it was almost silence. And I let myself cry, not the way I cried at Eleanor's funeral where the grief was mine and I owned every ounce of it. This was different. This was crying for a man I never met who wrote my name in the margin of his dying days because he believed I was trying to save him. When I could see the road again, I drove home. I went straight to the study, opened the notebook, the one that started with Eleanor's handwriting on the first page, and now held every piece of evidence, every date, every name, and I turned to the last empty page. I placed Danny's paper inside and pressed it flat with my palm. The handwriting was small and uneven, trailing off where his strength gave out. It was the heaviest page in a book full of heavy things. The lavender came back first. Eleanor always said it would because lavender doesn't care what happened to the people who planted it. It just reaches for the sun and does what it was made to do. I kept the notebook closed for 3 days after I placed Danny's paper inside. Couldn't open it. Couldn't look at that small, shaking handwriting without hearing a voice I'd never actually heard asking me why the medicine with my name on it hadn't saved him. On the 4th morning, I set the notebook on the study shelf spine out between Eleanor's Bible and a farmer's almanac from 2019, and I walked outside into a summer that had arrived without asking permission. Nora came home in June, not for a visit for good. She'd filed the divorce papers in April, and by the time the ink was dry on the decree, she'd already packed the Knoxville apartment into 4 boxes and a suitcase. She pulled into the driveway on a Thursday afternoon, stepped out of the car, looked at the herb rows stretching toward the tree line, and said, "I forgot how big it was." "It didn't get bigger," I told her. "You just spent too long in small rooms." She carried her own boxes. I didn't offer to help because she didn't need me to. And knowing when not to help is the first thing fatherhood teaches you if you're paying attention. The farm was already changing by then. I'd spent May pulling out the neglected rows, replacing soil that had gone sour during the months I'd been too busy chasing paper trails to tend it. Pete had kept the irrigation running and the deer fence patched, but a farm needs more than maintenance. It needs someone who walks the rows every morning and listens to what the dirt is trying to say. It was Nora who brought up the name. We were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the fireflies blink their way across the lower field, and she set her glass down on the railing with the careful precision of someone who'd been thinking about something for a long time. "We need a brand," she said. "Something new, something that doesn't carry any of the old weight." "I've been thinking the same thing." "Dawson's Earth," she said. I looked at her. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes had that steadiness they get when she's already decided and is just waiting for the world to agree. "Pete's name on every label," she continued. "He saw it first, before you, before me, before Arthur. He noticed the footprints and he told you, and everything started from there." Pete was 63 years old, had worked my land for 11 years, and had never once asked for a raise, a title, or a thank you. He showed up at dawn and left at dusk, and in between he did the kind of work that keeps the world standing upright without anyone noticing. If you've listened this long, you already know this isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about what you plant after the fire. I told Pete the next morning. He was kneeling in the basil row, pinching off flower heads the way I'd taught him a decade ago, and when I said the words, "Dawson's Earth, your name on every label," he stopped moving. His hands stayed where they were, hovering over the basil, and he stared at the soil between his knees for a long time. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice thick. "We do," I said. "You saw it first, Pete. You earned it." He stood up slowly, wiped his hands on his jeans, and nodded once without looking at me. Then he walked to the end of the row and started working again, and I let him go because some gratitude is too big to receive standing still. That evening I stood alone at Eleanor's garden row, the original 4x8 plot where she'd planted the first rosemary and sage the year we were married. The plants were descendants of descendants, now 40 years of roots tangled under soil I'd never dug up because you don't disturb what someone you loved put in the ground. "We kept it I said, quiet enough that only the dirt could hear. "Every acre, and Nora's home." The wind moved through the rosemary, and it sounded for just a moment like someone breathing in their sleep. Pete never asked for credit, never asked for money, never asked for anything except to keep working the land. That's exactly why his name deserved to be on it, because the people who don't ask are usually the ones who've earned the most. The next morning I woke before the sun, made coffee in the dark kitchen, carried the cup outside, and sat on the garden bench where Eleanor used to read. The mist was low and thick over the herb rows, turning the farm into something that looked like it existed between dreaming and waking. Nora came out a few minutes later, barefoot, holding her own cup. She sat beside me and didn't speak. We watched the mist thin and the light come in gold over the ridge. "New notebook?" she asked, looking at the blank book I'd set on my knee. "New everything." Pete appeared at the far end of the garden, watering the seedlings from a galvanized can, whistling something low and tuneless. He didn't turn around, didn't need to. 3 people in the morning missed quiet and unhurried, doing the only work that matters, tending what you've been given and making sure it grows. I uncapped the pen. The old notebook was on the shelf inside, full from Eleanor's first page to Danny's last. This one was empty, every page white and waiting. I wrote the first line in steady letters, pressing hard enough to feel the grain of the paper under the tip. Every page will be the truth, because that's the only thing no one can take away from you. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent 18 years trusting the wrong people. I handed over my formula, my land, and my family's good name because I believed a handshake still meant something. Family betrayal doesn't announce itself at the door. It sits at your dinner table, learns your habits, and waits until you're not looking. Don't make my mistake. Don't let loyalty blind you to what's happening right under your roof. The signs were there, I just didn't want to see them. If there's one thing I learned from all of this, it's that the truth has a way of surfacing. You can bury it under forged signatures and shell companies and boardroom smiles, but it doesn't stay down. Family betrayal cuts deeper than any other kind because it comes from the people you'd have given everything to, and in my case, I nearly did. But I believe God carried me through those darkest months for a reason. Not for revenge, for clarity. To understand that protecting what you've built isn't selfishness, it's stewardship. And family betrayal, no matter how deep, doesn't get to define the rest of your days. What you plant after the fire does. Now, I'd like to hear from you. What would you have done in my place? Would you have fought back or walked away? Tell me in the comments. If this story stirred something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Revenge Dad so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. This story contains fictional elements created for storytelling and reflection. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is coincidental. What matters most is the message, and I hope it stays with you for a long time.